This is the next workshop in the 2024 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Linguistic Diversity in the Heritage Language Classroom, Educational Practices that Celebrate Home Languages by Maria Quintanilla. Heritage language learners' linguistic, social, and emotional learning path is unique to each learner. A heritage language classroom affirms their identities, multilingualism, and cultural practices. In this webinar, the presenter will explore approaches for centering language varieties, cultures, and histories of our heritage language-speaking learners, and explore strategies relevant to classrooms with a mix of heritage and non-heritage language learners. She will present effective teaching strategies proven in the classroom for empowering identity, linguistic plurality, and cultural perspectives. Our workshop presenter today is Maria Quintanilla. Maria has been successfully teaching all levels of Spanish, including the AP Spanish Language and Literature courses to native, heritage, and non-Spanish speaking students for 16 years at the New York City Department of Education. She has worked extensively developing AP Spanish Language and Culture curriculum and writing day-to-day lesson plans for the AP for All initiative. She is a host and facilitator of citywide lab classrooms and has worked with the Division of Multilingual Learners developing curriculum and lesson plans for heritage speakers of Spanish to be utilized by New York City teachers. Maria is heavily involved in the implementation of the New York State Seal of Biliteracy for graduating seniors. She's a College Board teacher mentor, a model teacher supporting ECT, and actively promulgates the new New York State standards for world languages. Ms. Quintanilla is a firm believer in a student-centered classroom and eliciting the unique personal and linguistic qualities of each student in order to create a comfortable and safe learning environment. She is an etymology and linguistics enthusiast. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Maria to begin this workshop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Candy, and for having me. And I also want to send a special thank you to Joanne O'Toole for patiently guiding me and helping me put in this presentation for today's webinar together. So I hope everyone can hear me well. And I'm going to share the presentation we're doing today. Okay. I'd just like to take a minute or two for you to take a look at for two upcoming sessions for professional learning that are available coming up soon. Registration is available and CTLE credit is also available. And like Candy said, if you cannot attend them in real time, you'll be able to watch them on demand and still earn CTLE credit. So today we will be talking about linguistic diversity in there. Okay. Today we'll be talking about linguistic diversity and the heritage classroom, educational practices that celebrate home languages. But before going any further, I'd like to remind us of what Candy just talked to us about. There are a few symbols that you'll see throughout today's webinar. We're asking for everyone to keep their microphone muted. At some point or throughout today's webinar, you'll also see a blue thinking bubble where we're inviting you to think alone and to start thinking, how does this apply to your classroom, how you can make it your own. If you have any questions, we'll ask you to write it in the chat box, but we would like for you to keep any comments, unless they are a question, till the end of the presentation, or if you see the chat symbol appearing during the presentation. And finally, as Candy said, today's materials will be located in the Google folder. Okay, so let's move on to today's goals. Number one, I can celebrate home language in the classroom as reflected in the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. Number two, I can build a shared understanding of authentic and academic home language. And number three, I can implement responsive learning strategies for heritage learners in my classroom. Before we start, and before we start talking about the learning activities that we're going to talk about today, let's focus or let's start by reminding ourselves who is a heritage learner and what they can do with that heritage language, what their proficiency level is. A, a, a heritage learner is a student who is raised in a home where non-English language is spoken, who speaks or only understands the heritage language, and who is to some degree bilingual in English and in the heritage language. And as per ACTFL's proficiency levels, a heritage learner can range from a novice high to an intermediate high. So they can do so much more with the language. I also like to add that if we get newcomers who are native students who are native speakers, of course their proficiency level will be higher. So today I'd like for us to ground our presentation, our webinar, grounded on the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, which calls for us as educators to create a welcoming and affirming environment, specifically where students can see themselves represented, and where we value, where we celebrate all cultural identities, and language is one of our identities as well, part of our identity. It also calls for us to foster high expectations in our classroom, right? Making our classroom intellectually challenging, as well as encouraging or sending positive messages about self-image. And we can do this in a heritage learners classroom. The framework also asks us to identify inclusive curriculum and assessment, where we find opportunities to elevate historically marginalized communities or voices, and also where students can find perspectives other than their own cultural perspectives. And it also calls for us to engage in ongoing professional learning and support. With this in mind, the framework, let's start our guiding principles on authentic and academic home language. If there is a community, a group of people who communicate and understand each other in a non-official language, written or spoken, then that language is authentic and valid. As long as communication takes place, that language should be accepted, it should be celebrated in our classrooms, should be incentivized in our classrooms. So we're gonna talk a lot today about authentic and academic language. And what I like to do today is share with you a few things that have worked in my heritage learners classroom. And I'll invite you to, as we go through the activities or to learning strategies or learning activities, that you already start thinking how you can bring this to your classroom, and again, how you can make this your own. I'm going to start with linguistic pluralism. This activity has worked in my classroom, in my heritage learners classroom for quite a while now. Students really, really enjoy it, where I take advantage of the pluralism of Spanish. I teach Spanish, and I come up with a few words that I know have different Spanish speaking countries say it in a different way. I tend to find words that countries, if you see the countries across, I tend to use countries of students who are in my classroom during that year. So I ask them to look at the word in English. You can see the example here. Look at the word beans, and then they go through how we call it different names in Spanish in different countries. I do this for two things. One, to obviously you may want to increase vocabulary. Okay, that's fine. But also I do it so that students can feel comfortable, that they can see the way they say beans in their country, that it's acceptable in the classroom. So the way this activity works is everybody gets a copy of this, and then I give them some time to fill out the words that they know by heart. Then I give them time to talk within their groups or teams, right? So which one do you have? Which one don't you have? Okay, I found this one. I know this one. Then I ask them to move around the classroom so they can exchange information with another team or another group. And finally, I ask them to take it home so that they may ask their parents if there is a word that they may know. And what a wonderful way to celebrate home languages and also have the parents involved. You can think of this, and finally, they use their dictionary. If as the last resort I'll use. I want to leverage all the information that the students have in the classroom, and I also want to leverage parents' information, knowledge that they have as well. This is an activity that I can see happening in French speaking countries, right? Or German speaking countries or regions, even in Italy, where you may have different dialects. You can use this as a way to celebrate home language in your classroom. Another activity that has worked in my classroom that I'd like to share with you is say it in your Spanish, but it might as well be say it in your French, say it in your German, right? We're celebrating home languages. Each student gets a list of animals, and I ask them in partner one describes, in this case, the word bat in their home language. And student two has to try to guess what language the student, I'm sorry, what animal the student is describing. This works for two reasons. One, sometimes students don't feel confident speaking their home language. In my classroom, their Spanish. This starts to make them feel comfortable speaking their language. For example, the color brown in Spanish, in some countries you may say marrón, in some countries you may say café. Both mean brown. So students can feel comfortable speaking their own home language. And then they laugh, they share, they talk, and they speak their own home language, and they feel that it's validated. This has worked for me for many years in my classroom at the beginning of the school year, where there isn't necessarily content happening. It's more creating that safe environment for the students. And not only that, we get to also work with our interpersonal mode of communication as well as interpretive mode of communication. Okay, the next activity that works really well in my classroom, and this is specifically for Spanish teachers of heritage learners. We're talking about, today we're discussing authentic Spanish and academic Spanish, and we're celebrating home languages. And one of the things that I've found in my classroom is the use of vos instead of tú. Tú is the formal, official, not the formal, but the official standard word of saying you in Spanish. However, in many Spanish-speaking countries, the word vos is used instead of tú. And as a personal anecdote, I have to say that in my family, we use vos instead of tú. And I remember my teacher saying vos was wrong because tú was the word that she was teaching to me. Okay, so voceo is authentic Spanish. It may not be the academic Spanish, but in many Spanish speaking countries, this is the way people communicate. I start with voceo as one of the authentic ways that we communicate because it seems to be the one that most of my students are familiar with because of Messi and the world champions in soccer. But some of the activities I do with voceo is I give them a tango, and in the tango, a song, you can pick any song, but in the tango, the singer is talking to the his love interest in a voz form. So one of the things my heritage learners have to do is change that voz to tu. And the academic struggle that they have to go, productive struggle that they have to go through is fantastic. Just seeing them communicate with each other and not knowing where to write voz instead of tu is really it's amazing to see. Not I do this for many reasons, just obviously to let my students know that there are other ways that people communicate, and if there is a student in my class, one who speaks with voz instead of tu, that student feels comfortable. There's also a bolero where the name of the bolero is usted, and I have my students change it to vos and sometimes to tú, just to get the authentic Spanish going. I also want to point out that for the voceo, most people may think that it only happens in Argentina, but the voceo happens we have voceo in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Uruguay, parts of Colombia, some regions of Bolivia, and some regions of Paraguay as well. So even if it's just one student that speaks with the voceo, we're already celebrating that student's home language. Something else specifically for heritage speakers of Spanish is it's aiga versus aya. I'm sure that there might be at least one of your students in your classroom, the heritage speaker, who may say aiga instead of aya. And automatically the teacher in us wants to correct the student. Aya is the correct official formal word to say it and not aiga. But I am a fan of etymology, and I had to discover why some people say aiga and some people say aiga. So in the Spanish heritage classroom, if you teach a student who's a heritage speaker, he or she may say aiga. Well, let's think about this. If the etymology of traer became traiga, if caer, etymologically speaking, is caiga, even oír is oiga, haber, the etymology of haber really is aiga. But as we know, language is for the users and not only for the academies. So at some point during the Middle Ages, Aja became the standard form. And now some regions of, in some countries, people still say Aiga. The point of this is that we have to teach the formal Aja without demeaning Aiga. So I'm not saying that we're not going to teach the students Aja. We will, but we will teach it without demeaning the word Aiga. Some of the ways that I do this in my classroom is we have, for example, the day of the United Nations speeches, in which you are in front of the United Nations and I'm gonna be looking for, if you say aiga at the United Nations, then that, you have to be able to know when you have to say aiga. And if you're talking with me, if you're having a conversation, if you're participating in class and you happen to say aiga, it's fine because it's authentic Spanish. And the last example that's only specifically to Spanish that I like to share with you is lambdacismo. Lambdacismo happens in Caribbean countries, Caribbean Spanish, where the R is switched for the L. Not that people in the Caribbean don't know how to pronounce the R, but it's just something that happens in the language that the R turns into an L. Example, Puerto Rico may sound, or it sounds like Puerto Rico. Again, they say rico. So it's not like they don't know how to pronounce the letter R. It's just part of Caribbean language. I teach this to my students for two reasons, maybe more. One, so that if my Caribbean students happen to say verde instead of verde, they may not feel like, oh, I'm not saying verde like my teacher. My Spanish is bad. So I'm validating that student Spanish. And I also teach it so that my students from Central America, students from South America who may not use lambdacismo, number one, I don't want anybody laughing at anybody for their authentic Spanish. And I also want my students to understand that there are many ways of speaking Spanish. Again, the culturally responsive sustaining education framework, where we are creating a safe space for our students, as well as having our students learn other people's other identities as well. In this case, lambdacismo. Some of the activities that I do for lambdacismo, and keep in mind I teach high school, so this song may not be appropriate, let's say maybe for a middle school, but there is a song by an artist called Ozuna, and what I ask my students is to listen to the song, to identify lambdacismo phrases, then to write it in lambdacismo, and then rewrite the phrase in academic language. So again, we're going to be teaching academic without demeaning lambdacismo in this case. And it looks something like this, where the students may know this song because they are heritage speakers, but they don't even realize that they were saying volverme loco instead of volverme loco. This is something specifically to heritage speakers of Spanish. But when it comes to other languages, I'd like for us to start thinking about how we can think of this next activity and make it our own in our classrooms. Well, we have 1 minute conversations. In my mind, every Spanish one, every French one student is a potential AP student. So at the opening of the class, every day or whenever you want to do it, you pick one image and you tell the students, okay, we're going to have conversations, 1 minute conversations. You choose who you want to be in these conversations. Do you want to be, for example, the boy in the brown jacket, or do you want to be the girl who's using her laptop? Then they decide who, and then I tell them who's going to start. And then they know who's going to go first. And then I walk around the classroom with a timer. And after 20 seconds, I say, change it up. And then the other person speaks. And then 20 seconds, the other student talks. And then 20 seconds. Because if you think about it, in the AP exam down the road, they don't even know that they are getting ready for an AP exam. But during this conversations, my students love it. They're able to use their voz if they speak voz. They're able to say Spanglish if they want to, because it's not about the content. It's just a moment in the classroom to create community and to allow for home languages to happen. And I'm still walking around the classroom just to see who's engaged and who's talking during their 20 seconds and elevate home languages. Students may use expressions that it's only part of their home language. They seem to enjoy this a lot. And the backside of this is I'm preparing them for an AP exam down the road whenever that happens for them. But it also allows the students to celebrate home language. So again, one image at a time, and then you ask the students, which one do you want to do today? And then who starts first. And you as a teacher can get as creative as possible, or you can even ask the students to send you images that they'll like to see during the 1 minute conversation. So they only speak 20 seconds, 20 seconds, 20 seconds, and then we move on to the next conversation. Something else that have been working really well in my heritage classroom is email communication with my students. If there's only one student who's a heritage speaker, who is a native speaker, I'm going to communicate with the student via email in their home language. It, I'm doing it for many reasons, and I think this is something that you can implement and you can make yours in whatever language you teach, where you write in the home language or the student writes in the home language. I ask my students to, whenever they're not going to be present in class, whenever they ask me if I can accept late work, whenever they're going to be late for class, to send me an email in the home language. But I have to reply as detailed as the student was, and it takes a lot of time for the student, instead of just for the teacher to do this. Instead of saying, okay, thank you, I have to say, dear da 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 da, and I have to be as formal as possible. And we're teaching students to, at least in my school, teach them how to write an email so that not the entire message is on the subject line. I don't know if it's happened to you, but some of my students used to write everything on the subject line. Not only am I, again, getting them ready for a potential AP student down the road because they have to write an email reply on the AP exam, we are also going to be engaging in their home language, even if it's one in our classroom. And we're going to teach them in a way how to write a formal email. This has been very successful in my class. Students really have really, really engaged in sending me emails when they're not going to be present, and getting emails from seniors in the high school saying that they're not going to be present, that they're going to be late, just instead of just like wondering if they're coming to class. It's really, I appreciate that. And it creates a team in our classroom. It creates a safe environment for our students as well. Okay. And one of the practices that I really, really enjoy in my heritage learners classrooms is products, practices, and perspectives, which relate to our standard 4, right? Having products and practices relate to perspectives. This is the time when my students become my teachers. Not only they teach me, but they also teach their classmates. So I'm going to start really quickly how I do this in my classroom. We pick an event. Maybe you want to pick it, or they eventually select an event for one of their home countries or home tradition. In this case, I chose Day of the Dead because I think that it's a celebration that most people know, are familiar with. So that's the first thing we do. So I ask my students, pick a practice, something that you see people doing during Day of the Dead in Mexico. Then I ask them, okay, give me a list of products that you see. Now tell me why this is important. Write it down. Explain why this is important to people, right? Why do people in Mexico, why this celebration is so important for them? And then I also present them something new for them to think about. Or in my case, I did have a student from Guatemala. So All Saints Day is a tradition that happens in Guatemala. It's on the same day, November 1st in Mexico, November 1st in Guatemala. And I asked them, okay, find a practice, something that people do during All Saints Day in Guatemala. Then think of products that you see in Guatemala, and then tell me, why do you think people do this? Of course, this is after you may do a reading, you may show a video, you're teaching them something, and then the students come up with, okay, well, one of the practices for Day of the Dead is people go to the cemetery. They clean the tombs and they wait until midnight. That's what people do. What are some of the products that you see? Okay, well, I'm sorry, skulls, the copal, candles, music. And why do people in Mexico celebrate Day of the Dead? Why is it important for them to be at the cemetery at midnight? And then they give me the perspective. And if you have students from Mexico or whose parents are from Mexico, as a teacher, you keep learning more meanings for Day of the Dead. This year, I learned that the flowers also mark a path for the dead ones to come back to the world of the living. And that's why flowers are part of the Day of the Dead. And then we go to Guatemala. Okay, well, what are some of the practices that you see in Guatemala that you saw in this video that I showed you, in the reading that we did? Okay, well, people in Guatemala on the day of All Saints Day, they go to the cemetery and they fly enormous kites. What are some of the products that you see? Okay, well, they sew kites, paper, glue, bamboo, flowers. Now tell me why people in this town of Guatemala go to the cemetery, fly giant kites. And then the perspective is, well, they believe that the noise of the kites against the wind scares evil spirits away so that the souls of the dead ones can rest in peace. Okay, so I'd like us to think a moment, right? Here is an example of something you may want to do in a French class example, right? You may ask the students, or a practice, you may give them the practice, Flag Day in Haiti. Think of some products that happen or that you see during this celebration, and then explain the perspective. And then take that and compare it to Flag Day in the United States. What are some of the products that you see, and why is that perspective, why is it important for people to celebrate Flag Day? And you can do this. Take a moment and think, how would you do this with the language that you teach in your classroom? What are some of the events, what are some of the traditions that you may or may not know so much about, but you can have students teach you? That's when the students become the experts. And I'll give you an example in a minute, but maybe think, what are some of the events that you would do in your classroom? Okay. And here's another example. Mother's Day. I have Haiti, but it could be any other country. of the world language that you're teaching. Ask the students what are some of the products. They may say, in Haiti, for example, you wear a flower, and it's a different flower, a different color. If your mother is alive, if your mother has passed away, you wear a different color flower, and then you have a perspective, right? For Mother's Day, and then you compare that to Mother's Day in the United States. But there's so many ways that we can do products, practices, and perspectives with heritage speakers in mind, that we can validate their home languages, and that we can create an inclusive environment just by validating authentic Spanish. I'm sorry, not authentic Spanish, authentic home language. I do teach Spanish, but I want to just briefly, I mean, if you want to, we can go back to the pluralism. I'm going to go back to the practice of this one. I believe it's in the folder. I don't know if you have access to it. If you do, then you can open it up and you can make a copy of this, and you can start thinking, okay, what are some of the countries where French is spoken? Not only in Europe, but you can do African countries, right? Where French is the official language. You can do the same thing with German. And like I mentioned before, we can use dialects as well, right? How we can validate students' home language. So maybe also you want to start thinking, how can I turn this activity and turn it into my world language, the world language that I teach? Or even if it's just one student, how can I do the email communication with one student? If I can just move forward to the email communication, even if it's just one student in your classroom. If you communicate with that student in the home language and you take the time to reply in the home language, that's and where you don't correct their Spanish. In this case, if you take a look at this email or their home language, in this email, which is happens to be in Spanish, there is mañana with a capital M in the middle of the sentence. No, I'm not going to correct that for him or for her. Or voy a estar en un field trip. There is Spanglish. I'm not going to correct the language. I am just engaging in home language with this student to validate the language. And if I may just say one last thing about voceo, which is something that I'm very that is some of the things that one of the authentic Spanish that I really, really also encourage in my class is that vos, right? If you wanted to explain it, it's related to vosotros. You can also go there with the Spanish, but just creating an activity where the students can take a song. And it doesn't only have to be tango. There are a lot of artists that sing songs and they use vos instead of tu, and you can create an activity like this. It's just a matter of finding and informing ourselves, right? Where are the families of my students from? I've had many comments from parents, even from parents who've said to me, our Spanish is bad Spanish. That's no. I want to dismantle that. We want to dismantle that, and we want to honor and we want to celebrate and encourage that authentic Spanish. And the most important thing is we should teach the academic language, the academic standard form of any of the world languages that we teach, but we cannot without demeaning the home language of that student. Okay, so find one of the last things that I'd like to share with you is other learning activities that I do in my classroom. Well, I mentioned this one before, the day of the UN speech day, where we work really hard for a presentation, where I work with my students so that they're not reading word for word from a paper, or they're not just looking at the screen or the projector instead of talking to the audience. And where I specifically say to them, today we're going to be in front of the United Nations and we will be using formal academic language. But I never say instead of the bad language, just the formal academic language. And then we also have other activities where the day of telling your short stories or myths or legends from your country, where a student, one of the students stands in front of the class and shares with the other students something that we may not know. One of the traditions that we just learned last week in my class actually was the Day of the Cross, Dia de la Cruz in Paraguay. And this was an opportunity where a heritage speaker taught us that tradition, because I wasn't even familiar with that. And I'm a Spanish teacher, but that doesn't mean that I know all the traditions in all the Spanish speaking countries. That doesn't mean that you know all the traditions in all the countries where your students come from. But it is a wonderful opportunity for the students to become the experts, for students to celebrate their home language and their home traditions, and for the culturally responsive framework to be in play throughout our classes. So every child, every day, but we're trying to think of every child, every day. How are we honoring their home language? And one of the things that also has worked, and how actually lambdacismo, that Caribbean Spanish phonetic situation, I started to do research, was because we started listening to our recordings. If you ask your students to record themselves for whatever reason, like a presentation or a small podcast, or if they have to record themselves speaking and then they have to share it with you so you can hear it and grade it, one of the things that we started to do was to listen to each other's recordings. In my case, a cultural comparison, not on like a peer editing situation, but one in the entire classroom. So one voice was highlighted. In order for you to achieve that, we have to make sure that we have created a safe environment for students to say, okay, you can play my recording to the rest of the class. And it was in one of these presentations that these recordings that I heard for the first, not for the first time, but I heard one of my students saying, for example, caine instead of carne, which is another form of lambdacismo. And he had already said, okay, you can play my recording. And then I heard the word caine when he was speaking. And rather than ignoring it, and rather than not sharing his recording with the class, I did some research and I realized why there is that in Caribbean Spanish, the L takes the place of the R, or sometimes the I takes the place of the R. And it was a moment where I could make one student feel safe with his home language, where they say caine instead of carne. And it was a great opportunity to have the rest of the class also learn about why and how this linguistic phonetic situation happens, and to learn about it, and to also be like, okay, well, he's not making a mistake when he's saying caine. He's not speaking wrong, in my case, wrong Spanish when he's saying caine. And that's how my search for authentic Spanish began, trying to present different activities for all languages, all home languages, to feel safe in my classroom. And that has been one of the things that really, really has worked in my classroom. I know that there are just a few activities, but I hope that maybe even one or two, you can think about how you can make it your own, how you can implement it in your classroom for heritage learners. And I also would like to review our goals for today, just celebrating home languages in my classroom as reflected by the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. I can build a shared understanding of authentic and academic home language. And I can implement responsive learning strategies for heritage learners in my classroom. Now, I know that there might be some questions, and we did leave some time, I hope, for some questions that you may have. And if there's anything in the chat that we can revisit or talk a little bit more about it, then this may be the time to put them in the chat.
So while we're waiting for people to enter their questions or comments in the chat, I put in a link to a webinar that was delivered a while back, but it was specifically about the CSRE framework centering voices, representation within and through world language classrooms that people might find very interesting, that connects really nicely with what you've talked about today.